Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Like Vietnam before it, the West has chosen to forget Afghanistan. Beyond calling on it to improve women's rights and denying it access to aid and finance, Western governments don't know how to handle the place. In the meantime, its people have experienced famine and one of the worst economic crises in decades. Our next guest, it shouldn't be that way, and things could be very different. He's Charlie Gammell. Hello and welcome, Charlie.
Nick, hi, how are you? Lovely to be here.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much indeed. You, until very recently, worked for the Foreign Office as a British diplomat. You've written about the region quite extensively, and you've also been an advisor to various NGOs, and also worked as a translator, I see, for was it the ICRC in back in Afghanistan or some time back?
Yes. So I was an interpreter for the ICRC, interpreting Dari, which is the sort of Afghan dialect of Persian, and Pashto in different provinces of Afghanistan. And there you were looking at ensuring that all parties to the conflict respected the human right or the rights of people caught up in the conflict, so civilians caught up in the conflict, and then that was mainly working in prisons and working in situations where we thought that, or the Red Cross had reason to believe that a contravention of the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law had taken place. So interviewing parties in a confidential manner, and then presenting your findings to them. So the interesting experience now in watching the news is that a lot of the people I would go and visit in the prison in Bagram or Pul-e-Charkhi or all these Afghan prisons and speak with, they now have reasonably senior positions in the Afghan government, which is obviously a fascinating turnaround of events. And I remember I would speak to the prison director and say, do you know anything about the ICRC? And the prison director would say, well, yes, this happened to me once, when I was a prisoner here, the ICRC would come and visit me, and they would do the assistance that they do, and they would do the help that they do. And then I went into that same prison on that same day and spoke to one of the senior Talibs in the prison. I said, are you aware of the ICRC? And he said, yes, when I used to run this prison, you guys came and facilitated visits. So, I mean, and that probably, we'll get into this. That gives you an idea of the topsy-turvy nature of the last 40 years of Afghanistan's history, whether that's along ethnic fault lines, mostly along ethnic fault lines, and then you understand that, and then we're going to sort of broaden that out. But I'll stop.
Yeah, we were going to try and take a bigger view of this, but just on a very personal point, because the questions just popped up in my head. I mean, how did you react when you saw those terrible scenes at Kabul airport? You've been involved, academically, from both in the field, as you've just been talking about, but also as a diplomat talking, about policy overall. I mean, how did you feel when you saw that incredibly rapid collapse of government and the sort of rapid withdrawal, and I guess also about the actual agreement that preempted it?
So I think obviously my first reactions when I saw the everything unfolding at Kabul airport was one of absolute sort of sorrow, and I think the fear of people who were in those desperate situations was something which really struck home. And I think knowing people who were there and who fled, and that was an incredibly upsetting and tragic thing to witness, whether you'd been a part of it or not. I think the speed of the withdrawal. I mean, I remember in 2008 when I was there, thinking to myself, and that what's going on here is a battle for who can answer the question of who claims to speak for Afghanistan. And I remember early engagements with the Taliban back then, thinking to myself, the message that they've got for the Afghan people is, we stand up for Afghan culture, we stand up for religion, and we stand up for conservative values. And that's a very simple message that they could just drip feed into the rhetoric of what was going on. Whereas it was much more difficult for the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the Karzai and then the Ghani and all those different governments, for them, because what was the message they were saying to the Afghan people? We stand up for democracy. And if you were a landowner who'd had your land confiscated, or you'd been a victim of corruption, or you had a family member killed by the Americans or the Western forces who were there, these things are quite difficult concepts for us to grasp in our Western societies, where these have been enshrined for hundreds of years. and I remember thinking at the time, gosh, the clarity of message that the Taliban have as an opposition force. And they used to say to me when I would meet them, we know a little bit about your history, and we know that the SOE were heroes in the resistance against Nazi. And obviously, in the resistance in the Second World War against Nazi occupation of France. And obviously, I'm not making a direct comparison there at all. But they would say, what would you do if we invaded your country and we imposed values that were inimical to your own values? So I think there was a bit of me that when I was there and observing it in a humanitarian perspective, and then as a traveler and an academic, I remember thinking that the Taliban have something here that the government doesn't have. They have a link back to old Pashtun culture, which, again, I'm not debating the rights or wrongs of that, but they could say to people, we'll stand up for your religions. If you want, if your culture, your religion, if you want justice, if you want predictability, if you want lack of corruption, we can stand up for that. So it wasn't when the government fell, the speed of it was a huge surprise. But I think when you speak to people who were there and you really get under the sort of the skin of the issue, some of these Afghan government soldiers hadn't been paid for 3 months.
Yeah.
Taliban were there. And I think once they started in advance to a particular speed, they could have conversations with different commanders in the field on the Afghan Special Forces and Afghan National Army side and say, look, we'll pay you 4 months' wages, put down your guns, go back to your families, and we won't kill you. And I think that message, it was such a powerful one to people who'd been fighting this war, and by which time Ghani and all his mates had gone out to India or Tajikistan. And that message just resonated, and people just thought, "Yeah, okay, I think I'll do that."
Yeah.
And again,
it was sort of hollow. It was hollow there.
It was hollow.
Just to recap, I mean, since in the last 2 years, and we'll talk about this in just a second, there has been a terrible economic collapse. There has been, a famine. I think it's 9 out of every 10 Afghans are in food insecurity, on the edge of famine, or if not in famine. So there's a pretty disastrous situation. But there's security, isn't there, at the same time?
Yeah, this is, and again, yes, there is. And one of the historical resonances of the current Taliban regime is that people would often look back to the pre-2001, to the pre-Karzai eras with a degree of nostalgia. And it was based on that one thing, that at least you had security, and you had security in front of the law because you knew what the law was, because it's compliant with Sharia and it's based on Sharia, and also because the corruption is much less. So the security, I had a friend who was just there for 2 weeks, Western guy, went traveling on his own, took a guide, had a very nice time, saw lots of sites, met Taliban, and really did not have any issues with security. And he traveled routes that, when I was there and the security situation wasn't bad, I would never have thought of going on road from Herat to Helmand to Kandahar and then up through and then going any further up. I mean, the security is there, and people do like that. People like the fact that there aren't bombings going off. I mean, obviously, IS, Islamic State, Khorasan province, are engaged in some small-scale campaigns of bombings in Jalalabad, in Kabul, and Al-Qaeda does exist in Afghanistan, and I think ISKP has been attracting former Afghan National Army, former Afghan Special Forces, and also former disaffected Taliban. So that is an issue. But I mean, if you're looking at a sort of a quantitative analysis of the number of kinetic incidents in Afghanistan, I mean, it's just dropped rapidly. And the streets of Kabul are very secure. They're very safe. There is security. The war has stopped to all intents and purposes.
Yeah, I want to stand back a bit, and I can't help but think of attitudes towards the Balkans, particularly in the 1990s, and the line would go something like this. The history has always been like this in this particular region. There's always been ethnic tensions. These people have been out to kill one another, and it's always going to be that way. Looking at Afghanistan, I'm tempted to say there have been repeated invasions of this region, and that it has failed to produce a viable state, and that it's always going to be like this. So whether it's in the 19th century, whether it's the Soviet invasion, whether it's the Taliban themselves in the earliest stage and the kind of government they had back then, or this last 20 years, it would seem to me that Afghanistan as a state is always doomed to fail.
I think when I first got to Afghanistan and first started getting interested in it, I remember people would throw out these large generalizations, these historical generalizations. Afghanistan's never been conquered. Afghanistan is doomed to fail as a state. It's riven with ethnic and tribal divisions that are insurmountable, and that kind of slightly maximalist analytical approach is frustrating, not because some of those things individually are wrong, but because the weighting on those individual things is often wrong. And I think that if you take all of these things, if you look at the history of Afghanistan, 100%, yes, it has suffered repeated invasions. If you look at the cliche to say that Afghanistan can't be conquered, I think that's nonsense, because the Mongols absolutely decimated it, and completely, it was game over. So I think that as with all these things, once you dig a little bit deeper, you get the contradictions and you get the complexities. And is Afghanistan doomed to failure? One of the things I remember, the first time I went to Herat a long time ago, someone said to me, "You will absolutely love it. It's just like Iran." And I'd spent a lot of time in Iran beforehand. And when I got to Herat and lived there for a long time, I remember thinking, this is nothing like Iran. And people would say, well, people would say, well, Herat, people in Kabul would say, well, the problem with Herat is that they're far too close to the Iranians, and they're just basically a sort of another branch of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And you'd speak to Iranians and they would say, well, we can't really trust the Heratis because they're far too close to Kabul. And you speak to Western policymakers and they would say, well, Ismail Khan, he's a law unto himself. And actually, when you live in Herat, and I did it on the eastern side of Afghanistan, on Khost, on the Pakistan border, where you have similar questions and around Pashtun identity, the Heratis want to be part of Afghanistan. On the back of their bicycles running around town, there are Afghan flags, or there were then. I'm not sure what they are now, but they're probably Taliban flags. They're not pictures of Khamenei. They're not. There is a strong sense of Afghan identity that I think it's very easy to underplay. And I think in some ways Afghanistan is incredible. It's a bit like Iran. It's got this strong sense of national identity, and within that you have Kurds, in Iran rather, but within Afghanistan you have Pashtuns, you have Hazaras, you have Uzbeks, you have Sunni, you have Shia. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't fault lines along those that sometimes erupt in violence, but I think if Afghanistan is doomed to failure, I don't think it's because of ethnic divisions. Yeah. Having said that, when tensions sort of crop up, they do run along those fault lines. And I think if you could there's one way of characterizing the last 40 years of Afghan history. Sort of when the Taliban came to power, you had this great big sort of Pashtun dominant, since the Taliban came to power, this big Pashtun dominance in the government. And then when obviously they got overthrown in 2001, you had Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara dominance in the government at the expense of Pashtuns. So then that goes back to the anecdote I said at the start about the Pashtun guy who ran the prison, who was now in the prison, and the Tajik guy who was in the prison, who now runs the prison. Almost like that sense of a seesaw doing that. That is the case. Is Afghanistan doomed to failure? I think one of the biggest cliches on Afghanistan is that it's the sort of crossroads of empire, and it's sort of always going to be preyed upon by the different regional factions. And I do think there is a lot to that. And one of the big concerns that, for example, China, who's a huge player in Afghanistan now, it can be overstated how big they are, but they are a big player in Afghanistan. Why are they involved in Afghanistan? They're involved in Afghanistan because of the Belt and Road Initiative and the CPEC and the Five Nations Railway Corridor. All this stuff is central to, and what it rests upon. Are you still there?
Yeah,
I'm here. I think, and what this rests upon is Afghanistan's position in the region. And I think it really suffered for the last 50 years because it's been preyed upon by the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans as a regional base, the Iranians, the Pakistanis, the Indians, and it has been a regional football. And we're seeing some spillover from that, particularly with this relationship with Pakistan. But my sense is if you talk about the identity of a nation, yeah, Afghanistan has a strong national identity.
Okay, so I think, what we're really talking about is the self-determination. Is Afghans been able to, yes, run things for themselves? And we're not going to spend the next sort of 40 minutes discussing what the Americans did in their failure to build a state. And my focus is what's the situation now, and what are the challenges they face now, and are they able to, what kind of state are they building? And and then the question is, how should the West respond to that? How should they engage with that? And I know you've got sort of clear ideas on that, but just to start with the earlier part of that question is, what kind of government is there? You've got this supreme leader, Hibatullah Akhundzada, if I may have the pronunciation wrong. He's pretty hardcore, isn't he, Charlie? I mean, this is the guy who's banned girls from schools, women from public places, and indeed from most workplaces. And if this is the core of the Taliban's policy, it doesn't look like a regime that one can engage with.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so the governance of Afghanistan is highly centralized in Kabul and Kandahar, and what you have is a Pashtun-dominated government will want centralization, because they will have strong control centrally, and that will prevent, or that will help to sort of flatten out potential ethnic destabilization in Afghanistan. On the other side, if it were run by Tajiks and Hazaras, they would want a bit more decentralization, because that makes it an easier job for them to do. Akhundzadeh, Hibatullah, Haqqani, these guys are Taliban hardliners who have grown up in a very conservative Pashtun Hanafi school of jurisprudence that combines highly conservative approaches to Islam, but also the driving force of, I think, a lot of this stuff, and we'll talk about Afghanistan, the role of education for girls in Afghanistan, which is a huge issue for us over the Western governments, and then we'll talk about whether that is a good thing or not, or whether that is a viable route for us to go down. But Pashtun culture is incredibly conservative. And I think that there's a temptation to look at the Taliban and look at their stance on women and automatically connect it to an Islamic stance. And, Shir Mohammed Stanekzai, who's a very, very, very senior Taliban official within the government, cited hadith saying that, the Prophet said that education should be for men and women. So I think there is lots of religious stuff out there that says that the Taliban's stance on women is not consistent with Islam. Where this comes from is Pashtun culture. And Pashtun culture is so highly conservative on this issue that I remember people that I would work with for the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. These were people who listened to music, they watched cricket, they were colleagues of mine, they not that made a difference, but they were sort of people who I had kind of, you'd get on very well with. We had female members of ICRC, but then for those guys in Khost, their wives weren't allowed outside the house unless they were with them or a male relative of them or the wife. And I remember that gives you an idea of how deeply baked into Pashtun sensibilities their stance is on women. And I think this goes to some of the support that they have in areas like Uruzgan, Kandahar, Helmand, dominant Pashtun areas, where a lot of the stuff that the Taliban is saying, it can resonate with very, very, very conservative elements of Pashtun society. Now, the flip side to that is that Afghanistan for the last 20 years has seen a huge advance and a rapid increase in education for girls and education for women. And I think the flip side of that is that people have got used to having multiple earners in the family. So your financial situation has improved. So I think some of the tension that you have, and this is speaking to friends who are there, is that people say, I get why the sort of Pashtun sensibilities don't want women to go to education, to be educated. But at the same time, it was great when our family had 3 people who could go and earn money for us, as opposed to 1. The 700,000 people in Afghanistan lost their jobs recently. And that's a very conservative estimate. Yeah.
How does that pressure then weigh against, because you're talking about the conservatism and the need of the government to respond to the Pashtuns of conservative core, but how does that weigh up when you've got massive unemployment, food insecurity, and people who just want to, here they've got a stable government, but they can't feed themselves?
So a big part of that is outside of the Taliban's control. And I think that a lot of people say at the moment, well, there's much less corruption in Afghanistan. And the logical rejoinder to that is there's much less corruption because there's much less money. and money's not going in. So I think there are fewer opportunities. There's a bit of it where there's not so many opportunities for women to work in Afghanistan as there were, but the Taliban have a pretty vice-like grip over the freedom of movement in apart from in Kabul, Mazar, maybe Herat. If you are in any other provincial capital or any other village, you can't send your daughters to education establishments. You can't send your wife to go and work in the hospital or to go and work in the local office or to go and be involved in. You just can't do it. And I think there's just no pushing back against that. And the sort of popular protests in the main cities that have been very impactful in some way of bringing attention to the issues on a global scale, but the sort of real import of that, it's negligible in some senses. And I think what the worrying fact is that you see the Taliban banning things that in previous Taliban administration was allowed. An example of that is in Herat. There's a place called the Bogazan Honor, the females' garden, and under the Taliban, that was a place where women could go. Now that's not the case. So they've started to ban women gathering amongst themselves in public places, even in specially designated place for females. And
are you saying under economic hardship, the push is to become even more Islamist, if you like, because being close to God is your only solution? I'm trying to sort of understand why you think that's the case.
Yes, and I think the stubbornness, we shouldn't underestimate the stubbornness of the Taliban. They see this as an incredibly important issue, and this is something that goes to their DNA. It's a bit like the in Iran at the moment with the hijab protests. When a regime chooses to define itself by those kind of things, that's the hill they have to die on, and they just won't budge.
There was a talk, I think David Miliband was from the International Rescue Committee, the former Foreign Secretary, was speaking to Chatham House over a year ago now. And his point, he was saying that at that talk, and this was only about 6 months after the Taliban had taken over, he said that the West has a responsibility. They're there for 20 years, and they have to recognize that they lost the war and that the Taliban won. And that the choice you have is what do you do with what's left now? Do you decide to isolate this regime, and then what are the consequences of that, or do you choose to engage with it? So what's your, following on from what we've just said, what do you think should be happening?
Well, I think categorically saying what happened in the war, I think is problematic, not least because there were some incredible gains, and this probably goes on what I'm about to say, but there were some great gains in Afghanistan of some of these issues that we're talking about, connectivity, education. One of the problems with that is that it's led to a brain drain. But I think I agree with that. I think that you're having some insight on those potential negotiations with the Taliban. It rings very hollow if we say to the Taliban, look, we can't have a conversation with you because we're concerned about your human rights, your stance on women, which is a fundamental transgression of our human rights standpoint. Having worked in prisons that used to house people arrested by Western forces, and worked on detention sites that were run by US forces, worked in Afghan NDS, which is their secret police, the prisons that they used to run as a kind of observer and a human rights observer. If I had been a prisoner in Guantanamo, in Bagram, in Pul-e-Charkhi, and all these places, and now I was a senior leader in the Taliban regime, of which there are a number, I think I would look at those quibbles not quibbles, but I would look at that standpoint with a degree of skepticism, and I would say, well, where were my human rights when I was arrested without charge and spent 15 years in Guantanamo Bay?
Yeah, and then so who you to tell me what to do? So I get that part of it, but the other part of the calculation is what the Americans should do, what the West should do, and we're sitting on large amounts of money, foreign reserves that the Afghans held abroad, and we're not releasing. And I think it's $9 billion in total. Some of that has been following a court decision in the United States, has been given to families of the victims of September the 11th. But the rest of that could be unlocked. What's the current position on that, as far as you know?
So here's the thing. When my sense is now that Afghanistan is a geopolitical issue, and a lot of the Western governments' views on it, particularly in America and particularly in London, is this is not a geopolitical issue. This is a counterterrorism issue, and we need to make sure that, and as America said, we need to make sure that ISIS, KP, and AQ do not start to mount operations against Western interests from Afghanistan. So we don't want it to be like Syria in 2014 under ISIS. And I think that's a totally wrong characterization. Afghanistan now is a geopolitical issue, and again, if you look at the embassies that are present in Afghanistan, it's China, it's Russia, it's Iran, and it's Pakistan. And if that's not a geopolitical fault line, I don't know what is. So my sense is that we need to engage with Afghanistan. And I think there's only so long we can I think we can take a very high-minded approach, because as David Miliband said, we don't have the leverage. You know, the Taliban can say to us, the Taliban want money and they want recognition, but at the same time, they can go along without that because they have relations with Russia, they have relations with China, and they have relations with Iran and Pakistan. The Taliban would love to have friendly relations with America and with the UK, and I know that for a fact. But I think it's our inherent the issue of girls' education has become such a sort of
just follow the logic of that. You unleash the money, you release the money. You release the money or some of the money. What actually happens to it, and what's the impact of it as far as you see?
Yeah, there is a danger that some of that money goes to get the wrong hands. One of the mischaracterized, it's not a transnational terrorist movement. It's a Pashtun nationalist movement that seeks to have sovereignty within Afghanistan and seeks to be its own, the master of its own destiny. You can't guarantee that money won't end up in the hands of Turkestan Islamic Party. You can't guarantee that. So that is a hostage to fortune, which probably China will be a massive opponent of. If anyone's going to be an opponent of that money flooding back into Afghanistan, it is China and it is Russia and it is Pakistan.
You just give me all the arguments against it. I want the arguments for it going through.
Yeah, I mean, I think the arguments for it is that the Afghanistan people, to whom we promise so much, are starving. The Afghan people are without some of the basic needs that we promised them in 2001. That project of nation building, and we're not going to debate it, has failed. And I do think it is our responsibility to grapple this, to sort of wrestle this very difficult opportunity, and start helping the people of Afghanistan in a way that is possible. There's you can work through NGOs. You don't have to do everything directly through the government. There's ways of managing this which are possible.
Right. Okay. Let's start getting questions, please. So if I can see a question from Steve Kenny. Love to take his question in a second, but please, everyone, do add questions to your Q&A box, to the Q&A box there. Steve, are you there?
Yes, I am, Nicholas.
Yeah, go ahead with your question.
Okay. Thank you, Charlie and Nicholas. It's very good. I'm learning a lot. What is exactly the current status of our relationship, the U.S., Great Britain, other Western countries, with the Taliban? Are we talking to them at all, or are businesses trying to negotiate trade agreements? Anything at all? So,
Steve, thanks for the question. There are ongoing dialogue between. There was quite a high-profile meeting that made it into the press between CIA officials and senior members of the Taliban in Qatar, and I don't doubt that those are the only ones. I think it's in people's. I think people are starting to realize that it's in people's interest to have dialogue with the Taliban, because we might get left behind. A lot of the conversations stumble on this issue of girls' education, and that's been a real sticking point that I know, UK Foreign Office has tried to engage or is engaged in Taliban, but this is one of the issues that comes up that is a blocker to progress. Western companies, there's been a big influx of Chinese companies into Afghanistan looking to kind of cash in on the sort of lithium, the copper, coal deposits there, which are untapped. And then this isn't a new thing. China's had an investment in Afghanistan probably since about 2012. But being involved in some way with that, there's obviously I can't talk about everything, but Afghanistan at the moment is seen as somewhere that is stable. Whether that's right or wrong, I'm not sure. But the stability there is a potential attraction to investors. Western investors, Western businesses would fall so foul of US sanctions that I think that's probably far too risky a bet. But that's not to say there aren't economic opportunities there, and China is slightly leading the charge on that front.
Okay, the follow-up question to that is, I think it's counterintuitive in a way, Charlie. You're saying by the West pressuring the Taliban on the issue of girls' education and women in Afghan society, you're actually saying that's becoming a major sticking point, and quite apart from what their supreme ideological leader believes.
I think it's and having worked on sort of Iranian negotiations in government, I think if it's a bit like it's the sort of Central Asian version of you walk into a carpet shop and you say that's the one I want. It's not a particularly smart way to go about it. And just for the record, I think the Taliban stance on girls' education is abhorrent. And I don't think, going back to your first point or your point about David Miliband, we're not in a position to dictate terms here, unfortunately. We're not in a position to dictate terms. And I think if we pressure the more we pressure the Taliban on that issue, which is so close to their heart culturally, the less likely we are to resolve other issues. And I think there is a sort of diplomatic track that says we're not going to make progress on that issue, but let's find common ground that we can make progress on. And one is, to go back to Steve's question, AQ, ISKP. These are issues of huge.
Just tell us what the initials stand for, because not everyone's going to know.
Al-Qaeda and then Islamic State, Khorasan province. These issues, these are shared interests. Whatever the exact relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, the Taliban would rather not have Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. Like as was the case pre-2001, that was a very strained relationship between Bin Laden and Mullah Omar. And IS Khorasan province is a thorn in the Taliban side because of the spoiling role that it could play. So there are potential points of cooperation between UK or European and Western security intelligence agencies and the Taliban. But again, one of the sticking points is how do you work with an organization or a government that was until recently a terrorist organization that was subject to huge sanctions. It still is subject to huge sanctions. So we are facing stumbling blocks about how do we engage with this regime. And I think that we should come up with ways to engage with the regime, because they are, as unpalatable as that is, on many, many levels, they are the government of Afghanistan. And I haven't said legitimate, but they are the government of Afghanistan.
Then the other part to that question is, what is it likely? Is the US capable of taking these kind of measures? If you look at Iran, the Americans reneged on the nuclear deal with Iran, essentially, and then I can say from our own experience as a company trying to take tourists to Iran, the US Treasury has rules that made it impossible. Bank accounts being closed down, although what you're doing is completely legitimate. Yeah. So that's a sort of a roundabout way of saying is, I can't see the Americans politically coming around to that idea, A. B, their bureaucracy is so slow to move that it's not likely to follow through. And then the follow-on from that is should European Union policy and British policy be different from that of the US? So the point at which the US starts to see potential geopolitical gains, as in can they push back against the influence of China in the region? Can they hedge against Russian influence? Can they sort of push back against their foes? And I'm talking about Russia, China, Iran, and sort of potentially Pakistan. Is there a win in Afghanistan for America on those issues? And I think the point at which someone in Washington thinks, actually,
we could probably make some gains against China in some way by actually being involved in Afghanistan. The point at which that calculation comes into play, then I think things could move for US thinking to get back in. As it stands in Washington, there's a lot of apathy around this, and there's a lot of people in Washington who say, look, we got burnt for 20 years in Afghanistan, and why don't we just see how the Chinese get on? Because at some point the Chinese might get pulled into a conflict not of their own making that is incredibly ruinous for them, in which with their issues with Uyghur Muslims, there's a potential for China. There's a big banana skin for China in the region. If America doesn't get involved, what's the EU and the UK? UK foreign policy is in a difficult position at the moment, given that our lockstep with America. And I think that, going back to your point, having had similar travails on Iran, where American Treasury sanctions lead, everyone else gets sort of dragged in its wake. And I think that if OFAC or if the American Treasury doesn't, or if American policy doesn't push towards bringing some of those sanctions off, it's going to be very difficult for the EU and the UK to launch an independent policy in this regard. There is progress being made through aid agencies getting more aid on the ground and doing things in Afghanistan, but that's much more of a piecemeal effort than anything broader. But yeah.
I mean, David Mitterbaum was making that point, and this is over a year ago, that if you were to lift those sanctions, the impact on the Afghan economy could be enormous. And the idea of trying to raise money in the World Food Program, trying to feed people haphazardly here and there, is nothing compared to the impact of lifting those sanctions and enabling the central bank to operate.
I think one kind of institutional or constitutional counter to that would be people saying, well, look, one of the biggest drivers of corruption in Afghanistan over the last 20 years has been a large influx of money. And if you just turn those taps on again, there's no guarantee that the Islamic probity of the Taliban will be able to withstand all that money coming in. So I think you'd have to learn from previous mistakes and say there have to be incredibly robust safeguards around the deployment of that capital.
Okay. Diane Cook, I think your question has been answered in part, but I'm sure there's a bit more to be got at there. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, when you've just been talking, that sort of answers some of my question, that at a top level, the West, whatever the West might be, because it's got different components, seeing this as a terrorist issue, and when it's actually geopolitical for the cogent reasons you've explained. I guess what's going through my mind is that a few of the countries comprising the West, wasted a lot of money and lives in Afghanistan. Yeah. And actually the domestic populations found it very difficult to know what our countries were doing in Afghanistan. How do you think that they might be able to sell such a change to their own populations, which are not necessarily, populations in the West are a bit disgruntled anyway?
As in UK policymakers sort of shift, or Western policymakers shifting back to get involved.
Yes, and suddenly saying, well, we should be there because it's a pragmatic reason to be there, when in fact for the last 20 years or so, I think it's been very difficult for people certainly for me in Britain, to see the pragmatism of getting involved in Afghanistan.
So, yes, I mean, I think I would sort of watch when I was, looking at the 2021 fall of Kabul, a lot of the people who for a long, long time had been saying, well, what are we doing in these countries anyway? Were the same people on Twitter saying, why are we leaving? So I think you're right. There is some confusion around what we're doing there. I mean, I think what I'm advocating, or there has been confusion about what we're doing there, and I think that goes back to, and I experienced this as a UK diplomat, what is our place in the world and what is our role? And I sometimes think that the Afghanistan conflict, as was in 2021 before the Taliban took over, it was a historical relic from the late 90s and the early 2000s, and all the optimism that came with that period of our history. I think when I talk about going back into Afghanistan, I don't envision anything like the scale of effort that we had in the country at the peak of the sort of, from 2001 onwards. what I'm talking about here is a more higher level diplomatic engagement that we might have in a similar country in the region that is strategically important, but not necessarily going to be a place where we put lots of people and lots of projects. So I think that I'm not saying that we should suddenly go back in, hook, line, and sinker and really get stuck in as we were previously. And I think, as you rightly say, one of the big issues we had in Afghanistan is that you would have troops who were providing security for aid projects. And the minute someone shoots at the school that they've built and they fire back, this is not a nation building or a peacekeeping issue. This is a conflict, and you've just shot someone in my village. So these were very, very, very subtle nuances between nation building, ink spot, counter-insurgency, all these kind of things, which were so opaque and so nuanced that I think you're right, it all got very confused. But just to be clear, I think my sense of where we should be is we shouldn't be going back there in the same scale as we were, but we definitely should have an engagement with the Taliban that is open, and that is a hedge against, and when I say we, I mean the West, that is a hedge against China, Russia, Iran, and just purely because if we're in the country, then we're more likely to know what's going on there. I say we're more likely, you'd hope we're more likely to know what's going on there.
Yeah. Come to follow up on this is going back to what David Miliband was talking about. He wasn't talking about sort of sending lots of people over. He's just talking about unlocking access to some funds so that you've got liquidity within the Afghan economy, and so people have got access to money and they can actually, whether it's making investment in farming. Okay, some of it's going to go on poppies, but it actually allows the economy to grow a bit. He also says the central bank needs some support, but you could have some kind of monitoring system in place at the same time. Let's take another question. Alan Livingston.
Can you hear me, Nicholas?
I can hear you, Alan. Hello.
Oh, good. It's good to talk to you again. My question is, I recently attended an event where there were several Afghanistan generals and also some American military people that were talking, and they mainly talked about the fall and how it happened. But one of the issues that they brought up is the number of families and people that are risks that are still trapped in Afghanistan, and that these people are trying to get out. They're sneaking across borders, etc. What's being done to try and get many of these people that were left behind, get them out of Afghanistan, and are they truly at risk right now of their lives and fortunes by staying there?
Great question, Alan. I think there are about 15,000 by some estimates who used to work alongside the American military or associated with the closely with the previous government.
Yeah, I think a lot of the effort, and here's the challenge, because a lot of the effort should be on, there should be a lot of effort on people who've come to this country, and I'm thinking from a UK perspective, on housing them and getting them set up and sort of saying thank you to them for the service that they rendered during the West's time in Afghanistan. I can't really speak to kind of ongoing military operations or stuff that's going on, because that's not something I'm really really involved in. I do know that there's a lot of private initiatives by people who've been closely involved in Afghanistan for a long time to help get these people out. I mean, I say a lot. There are ongoing initiatives in terms of reprisals, but again, this is not a sort of a state-led initiative that's got funding and that's being done on a large scale. In terms of reprisals, obviously there's been lots of UN reporting, and there's been lots of reporting to show that these reprisals have been absolutely brutal. And I remember being involved in the 2021 withdrawal, and it was an incredibly stressful time to have had anything to do with Afghanistan on an official scale. And some of the calls that one would receive were harrowing, of people who were being chased by the Taliban, coming door to door. And possibly some people didn't get out, and the Taliban would deal with them in their own way. To what extent these reprisals are ongoing, it's not clear either way. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they were ongoing, but then at the same time, there have been a number of former Afghan army and government officials who have been incorporated into the state. So again, this hasn't been a wholesale revenge, but it also hasn't been a wholesale amnesty, as the Taliban are saying. And I think it's important to say that, particularly, and I can only really speak from a UK perspective, efforts to repatriate Afghans were going on prior to the fall of Kabul. So these were things that were being lined up in the sort of the spring of that year. So even though the incredibly distressing scenes of August 2021 do dominate, they don't tell the whole picture. So people were being got out beforehand. But I remember being involved in some of that, and you had people on the phone saying, if you don't get me out today, the Taliban are basically going to come to my house and kill me. I mean, this was a fact of life for people who had helped governments, who had helped Western governments.
Charlie, as time goes on, surely the government and the state is going to find money elsewhere. I mean, notoriously, it's involved in the drugs trade. It says it's clamping down on that. The Economist says that its income from customs taxation is actually doing very well. They've got rid of all corruption on that, and there's a flow of revenue coming in. And then at the same time, as you've referred to, there's Pakistan, there's China coming in, the Belt and Road initiatives. So as time goes on, I mean, how do you see that developing? You've hinted at the fact that this is not necessarily a stable government either. But I'm just trying to, can you, on the positive side of things, how do you see in terms of internal stability? How do you see this going? And then what are the risk factors?
So, and all of those people, all those governments you mentioned, China, Pakistan, Russia, Iran, China and Russia particularly. China and Russia are willing to. China is a big trade partner of Afghanistan. There's not a lot of trade, but I think it is Afghanistan's biggest trade partner. Afghanistan is keen to buy cheap oil and gas from Russia, but the tension of those relationships are that the Chinese really don't want to get involved in Afghanistan unless the Afghans can give assurances that they will clamp down on Uyghur Islamic fundamentalists who pose a threat into China. China are also not willing to get properly into bed with the Taliban unless the Taliban clamps down on the Baluch Liberation Army, because the Baluch Liberation Army threatens the Gwadar port. That's something that China will not countenance. So China talks about being willing to be involved with Afghanistan, but in reality, there's a lot of conditionality attached to that. China is very concerned about the TTP, which is the Pakistan Taliban, who are very, very close to Afghanistan and pose a serious security threat to Pakistan, who is China's obviously big regional ally. So there's some really nice talk from Wang Yi in Beijing with Mutaki, who's the Taliban foreign minister, about cooperation. But really, the Chinese are saying, we will only cooperate with you if you can prove to us that you can keep a lid on Uyghurs, TTP, and Baluch Liberation Army, because those threaten Afghanistan's ability to be a safe pipeline through which Belt and Road initiatives can go, through which train lines can go. So China is keen but very nervous, and also incredibly aware that it does not want to get involved in Afghanistan. And it studied its history very, very closely and saw how the Russians got sort of dragged very, very slowly into Afghanistan in the 1970s. And it does not want that to happen. Russia has a very difficult relationship with Afghanistan, obviously, historically. And Russia is similarly, it wants Afghanistan to be the sort of regional policeman, in the sense that it wants Afghanistan to contain this CT challenge that might go up into Central Asia, which it doesn't want. And it's looking to Tajikistan to sort of play a bit of a role into Afghanistan that keeps a lid on these things. So there's a lot of conditionality attached to the relationships between the Taliban and these different regional powers that I think places limitations on those relationships to deliver for the Afghan people. And I think it's blithe to say that Russian investment, Chinese investment can help Afghanistan because there's so much conditionality attached to it. Okay.
The bigger question to my mind is this. If you look at Afghanistan as a state, this is a very fragile one. Mm-hmm. and then look at other areas of the world where there are no states, where there are failed states. You can think of Boko Haram in Nigeria. You could think of, I think there are about 60 to 80 million people around the world who live within places without recognized governments. I guess that's the potential here if you have another failed state. I can understand the Western reticence to get involved again. I can understand the Chinese reticence to get involved again. But with that in mind, what should be the priority? What do you think is the main concern here? We've talked about geopolitical in terms of competition between powers, but what do you think from a Western perspective? And obviously we feel wounded, we feel guilty about it, and we don't want to be involved. But what should we be thinking about as our main priority?
Yeah, so I think just before I answer that, I think on the issue of territorial integrity and on the issue of sort of the statelessness of Afghanistan, I think, as I said at the start, it's a surprisingly robust identity when it comes to an entity, when it comes to identity, and it comes to its own sense of itself. And the Taliban is a Pashtun nationalist movement that is very, 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 it's Afghan to its absolute core. So I think the sort of territorial integrity, there's no irredentist movement in Afghanistan worth its kind of name. So I think I don't think there's a danger of a great fragmentation of Afghanistan. Herat's going to split off to the Iranians and Khost is going to go to Pakistani. So I don't think that's an issue. And I think that all these states are keen that Afghanistan remains, this discrete entity, because that helps them achieve their own regional policy objectives. In terms of what we should do, and it depends on what we want as a nation. It depends on what we want as the West. It depends on what we stand for. And I remember working in government on Iran, and we were obviously really keen. We wanted to know, what are the Iranians thinking about this issue, and what do they want from these negotiations, and where do they stand on this? And my rejoinder to that was always, well, what do we want? And if we know what we want, then we'll know what we're willing to sacrifice to achieve that. And I think that there's, I wouldn't want to answer that question because I don't know what we want as the West. And having said that, I think if you look at the West, and I think if you look at the rules-based international system and what we are trying to stand up for, and what we're trying to push back against, which is China, which is effectively China, Russia, and Iran, and potentially Pakistan. If that's what we stand for, then I think it's remiss of us not to have a diplomatic presence in Afghanistan.
So you're talking about rules-based order, democratic governance. That's essentially it.
Yeah, and I think we need to, it's in all these issues, it's axiomatic about knowing where you want to get to, and I think that was one of the big challenges post 2001. It was, we want Afghanistan to be the sort of Switzerland of Central Asia, and I think if you focus on a goal and you forget where you're starting from, you're bound to fail. And I think that a pragmatic, uncomfortable diplomatic relationship with the Taliban, from which we can hope to build something that's better than what is now, I think has to be the place from which you start. I don't think it's the best. I think in the circumstances, I think it's the best solution. But I fully am aware that it's highly unpalatable and probably deeply uncomfortable for us, not least because of lots of historical resonances and the blood and treasure that we spent there.